Hello, night traveller. Tell me where you are and what time your clock reads as we step softly into the quiet of winter. If calm history helps you rest, you're welcome to follow along here again. Let your breath slow, long in, longer out. Frost clings to eaves, smoke threads the still air, and somewhere a door latches against the wind. Footsteps thud gently over packed snow, then fade. Tonight we'll walk into winters that turned harder and see how people endured. Keep close, the light's small and the snow is deep. There's a low doorway ahead. Let's lift the latch. You bend to enter, and for a moment the outside vanishes, replaced by a hush of straw and ember glow. Your breath loosens. Wool itches your wrists where sleeves meet skin, and the reed-strewn floor sighs underfoot. The hearth is banked, a red seam pulsing beneath ash, and beyond the half-wall the animals shift, hooves scuffing, their warm, hay-scented breath riding little clouds into the dim. You feel it, how winter presses not just from the fields, but from the seams of wood and stone and thatch, turning the house itself into a careful machine for holding heat. Outside, a small bell carries across the white. It's the late bell, the day's last measured note, and with it comes a rhythm the village knows without thinking. Fetch water before the well crusts again. Scrape the snow from the threshold. Shake the rime from the wool hanging by the door. A child coughs somewhere to your left. The quick, dry kind you want to settle with broth and patience. Someone mutters a prayer, almost under their breath, not for spectacle, just habit, like checking a latch. This is the year's hinge, and you can feel it in the way the place is arranged. Summer scatters people, winter gathers them. The work becomes the waiting. Bread set yesterday is today's hope. Wood cut months ago is tomorrow's warmth. You step nearer the fire and hold your palms to the seam of its steady heat. The smoke rises, eddies, then finds its path up through the dark square above. No glass there, just a shutter against weather. So some smoke lingers, softening edges, scenting hair and cloth with its honest, prickly sweetness. Listen closely, and you'll hear the village breathing. 2 doors over, the slow chop of a billet being halved. Across the lane, a low laugh at some remembered story. Beneath it all, the faint rustle of rushes as someone turns in bed, pulls a blanket up, and presses their toes toward another set of toes. Heat is a social thing here. You learn the draft's favorite parts, under the door, along the floor, across the wrist, and you block them with rags and ingenuity. The partition is not luxury, it's policy. Livestock indoors aren't a quirk, they're a quiet bargain. Hay and manure, exchanged for watchfulness and a few degrees more warmth. Your clothing is part of the house, a moving layer of insulation you tend as carefully as the roof. The wool holds its memory of lanolin and weather, dense where it's been fooled, loose where you want it to trap air. Linen sits against the skin, a clean layer you change and beat on wash days when the sun is kind enough to lend a little help. The hood frames your breath. The cloak is a small room you carry with you, fastened and unfurled depending on wind and task. Meanwhile, on the far side of the fire, a lidded pot gives off a steam that smells of barley and something salted. Not special, just sure. The spoon lifts, the surface shivers, and you see the winter diet's logic taking shape. What keeps, what softens, what can be stretched. It's the arithmetic of survival, done with salt, patience, and a good seal on a jar. You think of the cellar underfoot, cool, steady, smelling of earth. The rows of crocks and bags, apples cushioned in straw, carrots sleeping in sand. Food is time made visible, and you move through it carefully. The village was set for this months ago. Communal tasks stack up like cordwood in memory. The gleaning after harvest, permitted by law and by need. The slow hauling of turf to dry on the common. The coppiced woodland marked and measured so next year's fuel can be next year's certainty instead of this year's emergency. Rights matter here, and so do relationships. A path through the wood can be generosity, or it can be a fine. Most people prefer the first, but they've learned to live with both. You kneel and bank the fire, not because ceremony demands it, but because the ash remembers. You rake it just so, nestling a coal, and lay a small stick across, dry, well chosen, then another angled over it. Tomorrow's flame is hidden in today's care. You notice how the house answers back. A creak in the rafters as the frost tightens outside. The faint ring of ice forming at the lip of the bucket. A hinge that needs fat. Someone will see to it when the light returns. For now, the work narrows to warmth, and warmth narrows to kindness. There's humor in it, quiet and useful. A joke about who snores loudest and keeps the ox awake. A mutter that the wind has opinions and should keep them to itself. It's not the laughter of feast days, but the kind that keeps your shoulders from creeping up toward your ears. You sip from a wooden cup, something mild, not water alone, and feel the small lift of calories and ritual together. Later, we'll talk about why that cup matters, how it became insurance as much as comfort. For now, the taste is steady and familiar. You press your palm to the door's wood before opening. Cold hums through it. On the threshold you pause, listening for crunching snow, for the quick footfall that says a neighbor's coming with a question, or a loaf to trade. The fire is small and the woodpile smaller. Fuel comes first. Step outside with me, and we'll see how warmth is earned before winter ever arrives. You feel the cold, steady insistence on your knuckles the moment the door opens, so you pull it close again and think in wood, in peat, in anything that burns slow and honest. Warmth begins months before winter, in rites and rituals that decide who may take what from the margins of the forest. A villager's right to estovas. The deadfall, the brush, the prunings, matters like bread. Trespass for a green bough and the fine can bite deeper than frost. So you learn the boundary trees by heart. You trade favors for a cart, and you glean what the law and your neighbors allow. In summer, the commons are a bustle of quiet industry. Families cut turf from the wet ground, sliced, stacked, and turned so the briquettes cure into neat brown heat. Peat isn't a fragrant fire. It's a long, patient ember that answers with smoke and a steady heart, especially in places where woodland thins. On drier edges, you gather furze and gorse, quick burning but stubbornly useful for kindling and for ovens that need a flash of heat. You lift brush in bundles, bind it with twisted straw, and store it high where the damp can't steal it. Meanwhile, coppice woodland, managed like a clock, throws up poles in regular waves. A stool cut at the right season sends up a crown of shoots, and in 7, 10, or 12 years, depending on the tree and the plan, you have fuel that doesn't ask for the life of the forest, only its memory. Monasteries keep such cycles in ledgers and in habit, measuring acres in prayers and winters. Villages too, remember, the shared work days, the cart that broke a wheel on the rutted lane, the neighbor who sent a son with a spare pin and a grin. Inside the house, the fire sits slightly off-center, because smoke has preferences, and you've learned them. The hearth swallows anything that will burn, split oak when fortune smiles, willow when it must, bundles of twigs for morning, and when wood runs thin, the pressed cakes of dung. waste those. All summer, the yard is a rhythm. Gather, mix with chopped straw, pat into ovals, and set along the sunny wall to dry. They smoulder with a slow, smoky persistence that keeps a pot mumbling without eating tomorrow's logs. There's a trade-off in everything. A brighter flame gives faster heat and more smoke. A bed of coals warms evenly but asks for time. Stone loves to drink heat and give it back grudgingly. So you learn to tuck warmth where you can, behind a settle, under the canopy of a bed, around a pot that shares its breath with the room. Great halls boast braziers and vast fireplaces that swallow trees and still leave draughts prowling the flagstones. Cottages make do with a lower flame and bodies gathered near. Warmth scales with ceiling height and purse. Forest laws put teeth in winter. Poaching fuel is a crime, even when it's dead wood, and judges don't care that your child's nose is pink with cold. So many communities formalize mercy. A day for widows to gather. A cartload set aside for the old and ailing. A line of boys sent to the coppice to bring back faggots for those who can't. Not charity, exactly. Insurance written in custom. You carry the memory of who helped last season and who will need help next. Here's a small moment. A father stands over a broken chair, fingers worrying the smoothness of the rung. The seat's gone, the leg splintered by a fall, and the choice sits in his hands. Burn it, and the room will be warmer for an hour. Save it, and maybe in spring he'll remake it with a strip of new ash and a little patience. He looks at the woodpile, counts the days till the thaw, and sets the rung aside. Tonight they'll burn brush and dung, and the chair will wait to be a chair again. Warmth is thrift as much as flame. Communal labor stacks heat into the calendar. In autumn, men and women shoulder poles from the coppice, lay them under eaves and count the stacks. This much for baking days, this much for brewing, this much to see a feverish child through a biting week. The mill needs fuel, the smith's forge needs charcoal, and charcoal itself is another art, a low, slow, watchful burn under sod to turn wood into a cleaner, hotter promise, a misjudged vent, and your night's work becomes ash and a rueful laugh, because the forest teaches you by singeing your eyebrows and your pride. Not every winter is equal. When the climate turns moodier and storms lengthen, what felt like plenty tightens early. You feel it in how carefully you bank the hearth, in how you close the door between the living space and the sleeping corner, in how you let the fire drop low when the pot's done. Smoke blackens the rafters and sweetens bacon hung in its path, a double duty that makes you smile. The snow outside glows blue, the coal under ash glows red. You sit with a cup that warms the hands as much as the stomach and think quietly that warm is a village-wide verb. Cut, carry, stack, mend, share. And that tomorrow, you'll do it again. Step back a few weeks, to the last bright afternoons when the sun still has a little generosity, and feel how the whole village leans forward into autumn. This is when time becomes ingredient, and every hour can be salted, brined, smoked, or tucked away underground. The herd is counted with a clear eye. Winter won't feed every animal, so slaughter comes with pragmatism and a quick prayer. The moment blades flash, the clock starts. Meat must move, washed, drained, divided and treated before the cool air loses its edge. Salt is more than taste. It's authority. You rub it deep into pork and beef, against the grain, palms stinging as crystals draw out the wet. It's work that leaves your fingers wrinkled and your shoulders sore, and you measure the expense with care. In some years, salt is cheap and cheerful. In others, it's dear as a saint's tooth. Barrels, scrubbed and re-scrubbed, drink in brine like they remember last year's labour. You pour strong brine, enough salt to float an egg, and press the meat under with weighted boards. If a coopering seam weeps, you swear softly and fix it now. Leakage is hunger in January. Some cuts go to smoke because smoke is a slow blessing. You hang strips of bacon and coils of sausage where the hearth's breath rises, or in a smokehouse of your own. Low roof, green wood smouldering. A draft you adjust with a careful hand. Oak or beech give a steady flavour. Apple or cherry whisper sweetness if you have the luxury. It isn't the flashy flame that does the work. It's the weeks of patient haze that dries and guards, painting everything the colour of late afternoon. Fish get their turn too. On coasts and riverbanks you split and pin them on racks. Wind scouring the flesh, smoke finishing what air began. Drying is the humbler cousin, but no less vital. Beans rattle in their pods. You thresh and spread them to sun and breeze, turning with a wooden rake until they harden into small, storable stones. Apple rings thread onto twine, dangling under eaves where smoke keeps insects shy. In the uplands, thin cuts of mutton become tough, clean sheets of food light enough to carry in winter journeys. Weather is a partner you can't control. A streak of damp and mold creeps in. You answer with extra smoke, more turning, a quick decision to shift the racks inside. Then there's acid, the kitchen's quiet armor. Cabbages become sauerkraut, pounded with salt in crocks until brine rises like a promise. Buried under a wooden weight and a clean stone, the pale shreds surrender to time, souring into safety. Turnips and beets accept the brine too. Eggs in some places find their way into jars of pickling liquor, pale moons in a sharp sea. You label nothing because your hands remember which crock holds what. Your nose will confirm. Vinegar from last year's wine or this year's cider sharpens everything it touches, a tart line drawn against decay. Not every house can afford sweetness, but some have a pot for it. Honey trap summer inside glass and clay. Fruit halves glistening in syrup that does double duty as medicine. The wealthiest kitchens flirt with sugar. Expensive, exotic. A market day splurge turned into quince paste, or preserved cherries, guarded like a treasure and brought out when spirits need lifting. Monasteries, with their gardens and hives, keep lists and schedules. The Solarius counts jars the way a ship's master counts ropes. You can hear the cellar getting ready. Sand is sifted for the carrot bins, the dampness tested with a pinch. Apples require their own logic. The bruised ones eaten now, the unblemished bedded in straw, with space between so one troublemaker doesn't start a chorus. Root clamps rise in the field, shallow pits lined with straw, filled with turnips and beets, topped with earth that sheds water. A small vent keeps them from sweating themselves to ruin. You trust the ground to keep its cool counsel. And beer, yes, that cup by the fire matters. Brew day is choreography. The alewife watches the mash with a patient eye, judging heat by a hands hover, not a clock. Weak ale for daily drinking, strong for feast days and visits, both safer than water that wanders through who knows what. Barley becomes body in a cup. Yeast is an old friend that lives in wood and air, no recipe card needed. Spoilage happens, of course, but practice makes fewer losses. A cask that turns sour still nourishes in a pottage, or feeds the pigs that will, in turn, feed you. This work is communal by design. The smokehouse door opens for a neighbour's bacon when your rack is full. The brine barrel at the manor might sell room by the cut. The miller's wife swaps a crock of pickled onions for a share of your dried pears. You trade labour too. You turn my fish racks today. I'll help lift your barrel tomorrow, because preservation is a chain, and the chain's strength is shared. You close the cellar hatch and feel that winter's pantry is part larder, part calendar, part prayer. The jars and sacks are quiet, but you can almost hear them ticking, each measure of salt and day of smoke buying you time. Food is tucked in, the way the fire will be banked at night, hidden warmth prepared to last. And food needs a place to wait the cold out. So we climb back up, brush the dust from our hands, and think about walls, floors, and the stubborn art of keeping the outdoors out. Houses in winter are not fortresses against cold so much as negotiators with it, built to make a bargain with wind, damp, and time. You can feel the terms in your fingertips. Wattle and daub walls, hazel rods woven like baskets, packed with clay, straw, and a little dung, hold a surprising warmth when they're dry, and a miserable chill when the damp creeps in. Stone, so proud and solid, is a great slow sponge for heat. It drinks from your fire all day, then parts with that comfort reluctantly. A handful of degrees that drift back long after the embers grey. Thatch above is a miracle and a menace at once, a thick, breathing coat of straw that shrugs off rain and nests birds, that insulates like a winter cap if it's steep and well laid, and that asks you to keep sparks on a short leash. Underfoot, the earth remembers every season. A packed clay floor once rushes laid in thick mats, the way you'd lay a blanket over a sleeping child. Those rushes aren't just for softness. They insulate, they trap grit before it grinds into knees. They carry herbs, sweet flag, lavender, rosemary, whose crush lifts the scent of the room and helps flies mind their manners. But rushes keep company with damp if you forget them, so you pull the top layer, scatter fresh, and shake the corners like you shake crumbs from a tablecloth. Damp is the enemy that doesn't shout. It whispers in joints, it breeds coughs, it slicks the hearthstones, it chills a bed from underneath. The whole house is organized to fend it off. Doors don't fit the way modern doors fit. They hang in the memory of right angles and are dressed for winter with hung wool and stuffed rags. The crack at the sill is a river for drafts, and you plug it with straw ropes and patience. Windows aren't glass in most places, not yet. They're shutters that decide when the outdoors gets to visit, or they're thin panes of oiled linen or scraped horn that let a dim, diffused daylight in and hold some wind at bay. In town, a glazed light might shine from a guild hall or a prosperous shop, a small jewel of a window that makes the night pause and look. But in your cottage, the light is a hole you can close, not a picture. Listen to the roof in wind and you'll hear the thatch talk back, the way a good thatch lifts and settles like a breast under a blanket. Where fires are many and chimneys few, smoke finds its own education, collecting in the roof's dark thatch to tan it, to harden it against rain, to scent it like a smoked ham. It's why bacon hangs there too, letting the house do double service, heat rising through the day and laying down a slow cure. But thatched towns learn fire drills the hard way. A winter gust and a stray cinder can turn a lane into an oven. So you mind the spark, you keep ladders ready, and you know your neighbor's bucket by feel in the dark. Inside, space is carved against the cold. A high open hall is a summer joy and a winter liability. So families make rooms within rooms. A bed boxed with panels, a canopy and curtains that create a small climate of breath and body. A settle whose high back stands between you and a draft's sly advance. A curtain hung across a beam to fraction the world into warmer and colder halves. You learn how air moves, and you make it move better. Tapestries aren't just stories in wool. They're windbreaks. Woolen hangings along a stone wall can change a room by several careful degrees. Floor layers stacked like clothing, rushes, mats, skins where the little ones sleep. The sheepskin turned fleece, side up for the night, down for the day. Windows ask for compromise. Shutters tight mean less light and more warmth. A cracked shutter means enough air that the hearth draws instead of sulks and smokes. In some places, thin sheets of horn are scraped to translucence and slotted into frames, a modest miracle that hurts fewer fingers than winter's edge. The choice is constant. Let out heat to breathe well, or keep it all and cough. You open, you close, you listen. Meanwhile, a hand runs along a hinge and feels the stiffness of frost. A thumb smears a bit of fat into the iron's mouth, and the door will not complain tomorrow. Indoors, the animals do their part, not as pets, but as heat on legs. A timber partition keeps hooves from bedding, and manure from the hearth, yet their warmth slides over the plank like a friendly draught. A cow's breath is weathering small. At night, you hear cud and feather, a soft shuffling chorus that says, the house is a barn by design, a barn is a house by necessity, and the two together make winter less of an argument. You bank the fire, you tuck the coals, and you tuck yourselves too, into layers that think like walls. Linen that wicks, wool that traps, cloak that sheds, hood that keeps your breath close. Then you make the nightly rounds. Is the pot far enough from the wall that dew won't gather? Is the ash on the hearth thick enough to hide the coal from a greedy draught? Is the latch snug and the shutter pinned? You listen for the wind's fingernails along the ridge and tell it, kindly, to try the next house for mischief. You rest your palm on the wall's cool skin and feel the stored summer there, however faint. The house holds the cold, yes, but by holding it, it teaches you where warmth wants to live. And you learn. Every winter is a tutor, every spring a short graduation. Tomorrow we dress the body like another house. Tomorrow begins at the chest where the clothes live, and the first thing your hands find is linen, cool, clean, honest. It meets the skin because it wicks what winter tries to freeze. A long shirt, a shift, washed when weather allows and beaten on the board till it sighs, is the layer that keeps the rest from needing a scrub every week. Over it goes wool, the true winter craft. Not just a fibre, but a logic of warmth. Trap air, slow wind, shed wet, keep moving. Wool remembers the sheep and the hill. Some of its lanolin lingers after scouring, a faint slickness that shrugs off drizzle and melting snow, that makes a sleeve bead instead of soak. The weave is chosen like you choose a path, tight and fulled for a cloak that blocks a gale, looser for a tunic that wants to breathe while you chop. Fulling mills beat cloth until it thickens, the fibres felting together into a dense, springy pad. Walk past the mill and you hear the thump, 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 warmth being built by rhythm. Layering isn't fashion, it's engineering by hand. A linen shift under a kirtle, then a surcoat, a tunic over a shirt, then a hood and cloak that's half tent, half embrace. Each piece has a job. A hood makes its own weather around your face, catching your breath so it warms the air you breathe next. A cloak hangs long to shed sleet the way thatch sheds rain, cut in a circle or half so it swings and wraps, pinned at one shoulder for work, clasped full for watchfulness. When wind looks for a way in, you answer with overlap and ties. Hands need their own plan. Mittens are simple pockets of felted wool, sometimes lined, fingers huddled together to keep their common heat. For finer tasks, fingered gloves of knit or sewn cloth serve. though you're quick to pull the mitten over them again when the axe rests. A cap sits under the hood, close to the skull. Wool felt pressed from carded fibers into a thick, obedient bell that doesn't mind snowflakes. Ears thank you by staying attached. Feet are negotiations with the earth. Leather shoes, turned sewn and greased with tallow or oil, keep out wet as best they can, but cold rises through ground as much as it falls from sky. So you make an insole of straw, a braided mat that traps air and dries quickly by the hearth, and you change it when it remembers puddles too well. Over shoes you strap patterns, wooden soles that lift you from slush and muck, clacking gently on frozen lanes, a sound winter learns to associate with perseverance. Repair is part of dressing. In the evenings, with rushlight breathing small and steady, needles travel. Elbows get patches, knees a double layer, heels darned with close little bridges of thread that turn holes back into fabric. It's quiet work that saves lives in a way extravagance can't. A garment can be cut down for a smaller body, then pieced into a cap, then into mitts, then into a child's doll, or a rag that polishes the pan. Nothing wasted, not because misery demands it, but because wisdom prefers it. Meanwhile, cloth is social. The spinner's distaff leans against her chair. She twists fleece into a thread as naturally as breathing. The spindles were a household metronome. Warp and weft are neighbours' labour. You can point to a sleeve and say who carded, who spun, who wove, who fulled, who stitched. And in that chain, there's heat. A borrowed cloak carries someone else's warmth for a while. A literal kindness you can feel on your shoulders. For those with coin, fur lines the world. Sheepskin for many. Squirrel, marten, or fox for the lucky. But even simple folk know a pelt sense. Wool turned inward for sleeping, outward for walking. A border of fur at a cuff, where wind sneaks most. Wealth writes warmth with embellishment. Thrift writes it with sound choices. More cloth at chest and back. Lacing that adjusts when you've lost a little weight by February. You may have heard a story that people never bathed. That's a tale winter likes to tell to feel proud. In truth, washing is selective, seasonal, and sensible. Linen shifts are changed and boiled when the heavens allow a dry day. Bodies are wiped with cloths steeped in herbs. Steam is welcomed when a bathhouse fire can be coaxed to generosity. In cold months, it's less about soap and more about staying warm while staying clean enough. We'll open that door gently later. Clothes are rooms you wear. In bed, a nightcap keeps heat from slipping away. Bed curtains hold the shared breath of sleepers. Daytime garments warmed by bodies become blankets for little feet. In storm, a cloak becomes a door between you and the world. And when you step back indoors, you hang it where it can dry without stealing the fire's entire afternoon. Get this. The best compliment in January is practical. Your stitches hold. It means your craft keeps your blood close to you. Tomorrow's chores will be met by wool that knows its work, linen that minds the damp, leather that flexes with your stride. The body becomes a hearth, and what you wear is the stonework that keeps its flame from wandering. Down the ladder into the cool, you meet the cellar's careful breath, steady as a sleeping animal. The air tastes of damp stone and old apple, of wood and yeast, and the faint metallic note of iron hoops hugging barrels. This is where time is kept in edible form, where modest things, grain, water, salt, yeast, become winter's backbone. Bread and beer, the daily twins that never boast and rarely fail, Bread begins as a promise stored in sacks. Barley, rye, sometimes wheat, when fortune allows, sit in darkness, a dry hush guarding their strength. Before dawn, hands grind and sift, the rhythm a soft percussion. Quernstone turning, flour whispering into the trough. Sourdough is the house's quiet companion, a jar of living memory you feed with a scoop of yesterday to leaven today. In winter, the starter slows, so you keep it close to the hearth by day and to your own warmth by night, its faint bubble like a contented sigh. Dough hugs the bowl, then loosens, then rises under a cloth you've floured 100 times. Communal ovens beckon. On baking days, the lane is a procession of boards and baskets, neighbours trading a nod and a joke about who's pinched whose crust. The loaves that come home carry heat under their brown skin, and the knife meets them with a practiced gentleness. You slice thick because thin feels mean in January, and the crumb smells like fields and sunlight you can't see right now. Bread is steady, but it asks for company. A ladle of pottage, a smear of fat saved from autumn, a sprinkle of salt when you're feeling rich. Small kindnesses that make a meal. You stretch a loaf with ground peas or beans when grain is low. The flavour shifts. The belly doesn't complain. Tomorrow, the heel will thicken a broth, then soften into comfort. Nothing wasted. Everything employed. Beer, ale, really, turns grain into drinkable strength. Brew day sets the house humming. Water warms in the mash tun. Malted barley meets it in a cloud of sweet steam. The alewife stirs with a paddle that knows its own weight, testing by hand, not numbers. Wort runs bright through a bed of spent grain into the kettle, and if you favour herbs, you toss in groot, yarrow, bog myrtle, rosemary, sharp companions in years before hops march in from the south in a serious way. The boil is a rolling talk with the liquid, skimming, watching, waiting, cooling calls for patience and clean hands. Yeast, saved from the last brew, wakes with a familiar thirst, and the tub begins its quiet fizz. You cover it against meddlesome air and let time and the small creatures do their work. Weak ale, small beer, goes to the table with every meal, safer than the well, gentler than a feast. It carries calories your body will remember at midnight. Stronger brew waits for guests and holy days, its deeper colour matched by a heavier hand with malt. Casks are wedged tight in the cellar's cradle, bung snug, hoops checked, so a precious gallon isn't lost to a careless dry stave. Spoilage still happens. When a barrel turns, you wrinkle your nose, shrug, and pour it into the pottage where acidity becomes brightness. Or you feed it to pigs who mind taste less than we do. The cellar holds other quiet plans. Carrots doze in sand, their tops clipped, their skins clean and dry. The trick is air, enough that they don't sweat into rot, not so much that they shrivel into memory. Turnips heap under a scoop of earth that smells faintly of last summer's rain. Apples rest in straw like careful eggs, each one's health an individual concern. Bad fruit banished quickly, so it can't start a whispering campaign. Cabbage crocks sit shoulder to shoulder, wooden weights under brine, lids labelled by a knotted cord you can read in the dark. When you lift one, the sauerkraut smells like wakefulness, sharp, alive, a small sun for a winter mouth. Spice is a visitor here, not a resident, but when it visits, it's welcomed like a travelling storyteller. Pepper pinches into a pot when a cough lingers. Cumin and fennel lend warmth to a fasting day stew that lacks meat but not care. Cloves swim in a warm cup on a feast night and make the room smell like generosity. These aren't disguises so much as negotiations, medicine with flavour, comfort with intention. Listen for a micro-story. A loaf sits on the board, not quite enough for everyone. A mother cuts it with an eye that's equal parts love and arithmetic. She mixes pea flour into tomorrow's dough, sets a small sponge now so it will rise in the cold, and slides the largest slice to the elder who woke all night with a rattle in his chest. She's banking heat and health the same way she banks the hearth, hiding strength against a late frost. There's wit here too, a quip about thin ale making for sober saints, a wink when a child sneaks a warm end and leaves a butter-smudged grin. You climb the ladder back toward the light with a loaf under your arm and a cup balanced carefully, thinking how these simple things, grain and water, salt and yeast, patience and practice, carry whole families through deep months, even with stores tucked close and flavors coaxed from the quiet. Winter keeps its own counsel, and sickness waits for a weak moment. We'll tend the body's defenses next, where smoke, crowding, and cold lean on lungs, and care becomes its own kind of craft. The door closes, the latch settles, and with it the room's breath grows thicker. Warmth stays, but so does smoke, and winter begins its quiet negotiation with your lungs. Cold air outside narrows the chest. Inside, the hearth's haze scratches at throats already lean from a tighter table. Crowding is policy this season, people layered like blankets, and closeness carries love, yes, but also coughs. You hear it at night, the soft bark of a child, the damp rattle of an elder, the small chorus that tells you infection is making its rounds with comfortable shoes. Respiratory illness wears familiar masks. A cold arrives with a scratch and a sniff. It's not frightening, just insistent. But where diet's thin and air sits stale, a simple cold can become something heavier. Fevers run hot, then fade, then come back with the stubborn rhythm of a drum. Lungs fill, not with terror, but with fluid that makes climbing the ladder feel like crossing a field. Call it influenza-like, aches, heat, the taste of pennies at the back of the tongue. Or call it a winter fever. Names matter less than the pattern. Crowded rooms, smoky rafters, tired bodies, and the cough that doesn't leave when the snow does. Care meets limits with tenderness. Broths simmer at the edge of the fire, fat carefully skimmed. Salt added not for flavor alone, but for the body's balance. Herbs steep in covered cups. Thyme for its sharp kindness. Hyssop for a chest that won't let go. Elderflower for sweat that breaks a fever's hold. A cloth warmed on the lid and laid over ribs offers a comfort science will later explain. Tonight, it simply helps. Windows crack for a moment despite the cold, just long enough for the room to exhale and the fire to find its draw again. You trade a few degrees for easier breathing and count it a bargain. Meanwhile, lice and fleas find winter hospitable. Layers stay on longer. Heads touch more often. Blankets are shared. Linen shifts pulled clean help. Combs passed hand-to-hand help. A pot of water brought to steaming on bath day helps more. In towns with bathhouses, steam lifts coughs and spirits both, though not every week and not for everyone. In the countryside, a wash tub by the hearth and a quick washing when the day is kind keeps skin calm and parasites lonely. Drying thoroughly becomes medicine. Damp against skin is an invitation for misery. Listen for a small moment. A mother wakes to the sound of a cough that's changed. Not louder, lower, sticky. She stirs the embers, ladles a thin broth, and sits the child upright against her own chest so gravity lends a hand. She hums, which helps the child, and steadies her breath, and waits for the fever to break its small siege. In the morning, she'll carry the child into the light and open the shutter for 10 slow breaths, counting under her tongue. It isn't grand, but it's skill, learned by winters and neighbors and long memory. Malnutrition doesn't announce itself with drama. It steals in at the edges. When calories dip, bodies borrow from savings they don't have, and the immunity that once swatted away a cold now shrugs and lets it in. The ale you drink with meals isn't a luxury so much as a quiet reinforcement. Calories, a little B vitamin backbone, safer water in a cup that tastes of work. A crust under broth becomes more than flavor, it's endurance. Scurvy is rarer where sauerkraut sits in crocks and onions go into stews, rarer where turnips and cabbages hold court. Where they don't, gums tell you what the doctor can't remedy. Care rituals draw a circle wider than the hearth. Parish visitors bring a loaf and news, a neighbor swaps time for onions. The monastery's infirmary door opens for a fever that won't break. Prayers are whispered, not bargaining chips so much as breath given shape. And a candle is lit, which warms a hand even if it doesn't melt a illness. Doctors, when they appear, talk of humours and balance, and sometimes bleeding makes a strong person weaker for no gain. The village knows this, and folds the learned man's advice into its own. Rest, broth, air, warmth, patience. Crowding solves one problem and invites another, so rooms within rooms show their worth. Bed curtains keep sleepers warm, but they're drawn back in the day to let air wash bedding. Brushes are pulled and refreshed when they grow tired of being faithful. Damp ones become tomorrow's smoke, not tonight's floor. A settle is moved an arm's length to keep a grandparent in warmth and out of the thickest smoke. Children are told, gently, to carry their laughter to the door for a few moments and let it fly outside, while a window cracks and shuts. Then there are winters. The climate hammers a little harder. Rains that make harvests sulk. Cold that lingers past good manners. And people go into the cough season, already dimmer at the edges. Those winters teach painful arithmetic. A fever that would have been shrugged off last year lingers. A lung that had strength now rasps. The ledger of who needs a bowl first lengthens. Yet the same winters deepen skills. A village becomes deft at ventilating without freezing. At brewing stronger small ale when water runs questionable. At dosing herbs with care and timing. When the cough finally loosens, the room feels larger. A child sleeps flat without rousing. An elder asks for bread before noon. The shutters crack and stay a thumb wider all day. You bank the fire with a practiced hand and feel, under the soot and smoke, that health here is built like everything else this season. Layered, shared, tended, never assumed. And to understand why some winters press so hard on chest and spirit alike, we need to step back from this room and watch the sky change its mind over centuries. To understand the cough that lingers and the woodpile that never seems tall enough, we need to listen to the weather's long conversation with the land. For a few centuries, Europe moved under what many now call the medieval climate anomaly, a period when, in much of the west and north, winters tended to be kinder, growing seasons a touch longer, and the plough's bite reached into hills that had previously shrugged it off. Fields crept uphill, vines tested edges of latitude with more confidence, and settlements pushed outward as if warmth were a steady promise. Meanwhile, the North Atlantic's mood, steered by patterns like the North Atlantic Oscillation, often favored milder westerlies. A positive phase, more west to east flow, meant damp, relatively soft winters in places like England and the Low Countries. while other regions knew their own quirks. This wasn't uniform sunshine. Weather is local, stubbornly so. But across many years, the balance nodded toward gentler cold, and with it came expansion. More mouths to fill, more barns, more lanes, more faith that a good harvest could be repeated with care and a little luck. What nobody knew at the time was that the sky's generosity had a slope. By the late 13th century, hints gathered, summers turned fickle, rains lingered where they weren't invited, winters grew sharper in places that had counted on moderation. The timing varied by region, and the change wasn't a single door slamming, but a hallway of cooler thresholds. Tree rings tightened, ice in far-off cores thickened its story. Glaciers began to push down their valleys with a quiet, grinding patience, especially in the Alps, where summer's melt no longer ate enough of winter's gift. This was the moment everything changed for villages that had built their calendars on the older rhythm. Colder, wetter summers in the early 14th century set up the cruel equation of the Great Famine. Seed rotting in sodden ground, hay cut too late and too thin, animals weakened before winter even raised its eyebrow. The winters that followed weren't the only villains, but they were accomplices. Longer, sometimes snowier, often simply persistent. Damp and cold together do a particular kind of work on bone and spirit. Bread ran short. Fuel was rationed. Disease found a softer landing in bodies without reserves. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the large-scale dance of air and sea. The precipitation seesaw appeared across Europe, with the north soaking while the south sulked under relative dryness. Then the pattern flipping, a kind of atmospheric tug of war. Farmers didn't know the term. They only knew that what had been reliable turned jittery. One valley's winter would come late and loud, another's would come early and hang on past courtesy. Markets, linked by roads and rivers, became lifelines or bottlenecks, depending on wind and water. A scribe in a town that rarely saw ice watched a river skin over and took up his pen. He noted the way children laughed at their breath and the way mill wheels slowed, then stopped. That line sits in a margin, brown ink now, a small astonishment captured. It's a human-sized way of measuring climate. Not by degrees, but by whether the ferry runs, whether the fish ladder works, whether the bell rope grows stiff with hoarfrost when it never used to. Volcanic murmurs far away occasionally smeared a veil across the sun, lending brief, eerie assist to the cooling. Solar cycles dimmed and brightened on their own schedule. Together with ocean currents and shifting winds, they compose the score of what we call the Little Ice Age. Centuries of cooler tendencies punctuated by brutal winters and odd summers. Again, not a uniform icebox, but enough of a trend that architecture, agriculture, and habit learned new manners. In the aftermath of those shifts, warmth became destiny in a way it hadn't been when seasons were easier. Coppice cycles tightened, peat stacks grew higher, chimneys rose and narrowed to pull smoke and keep sparks in line. Diets leaned harder into what kept well and what kept people standing. Ale as liquid bread, cabbage as quiet medicine, fat as treasured insurance. Villages moved in small ways, shelters tucked closer to lee slopes, barns widened to house more animals through longer stalls, doorways hung with heavier cloth. Cities built more ovens, more brew houses, more hospitals. From the perspective of our snug room, these centuries feel like a slow hand on the dimmer switch. The light didn't vanish, it lowered, and in that half-light, winter's lessons turned sterner. People adapted with the tools they had, Wood and wool, salt and yeast, faith and habit, meeting a cooler sky with warmer rooms and practiced thrift. Colder years would still allow laughter. Warmer ones would still punish the unprepared. But the baseline shifted, and with it, endurance became a more deliberate craft. While that was happening in great spans of time, the ember in our hearth needed the same banking it always did. The child's cough still asked for broth. The hinges still wanted fat. Big climate arcs lean on small gestures, and small gestures, stubborn as weeds, keep households alive through wide, impersonal trends. With colder winters rising in the story, fuel and heat turn once again into the pivot on which everything else swings. Let's step back to the stack and the peat bank, to smoke and ember, and see how people learn to keep the fire without losing the roof. With the winters turning sterner, fuel became not just comfort but policy, and the year bent around the work of finding fire without stealing tomorrow's trees. On the bog, summer blades cut turf into neat bricks, each slice lifted with a squelch and a grunt, laid on its side, then its edge, then stacked in little chimneys to drink the sun. Weeks pass. Wind does the quiet labor of 1,000 hearths yet to be lit. By harvest's edge, a field of peat stands brown and ready, each brick a slow ember waiting for snow. Forest law breathed down from lordship like chilly air from a door left ajar. Estovers, your rights to dead wood, hedge clippings and underwood, were lifelines, but green branches were trouble. A coppice cut outside its cycle could cost you coin you didn't have, or a day's humiliation at the manor gate. So the village kept calendars as carefully as abbeys kept psalters. Ash in 12 years, hazel in 7, oak in 20, if you were patient and wealthy enough to plan. Monastic woodwards walked the lines with measured steps, staff tapping stumps, counting shoots like a clerk tallies rents. Mercy lived in the margins, an agreed widow's day for gathering, a cart from the Lord's yard for the infirm, the discreet turning away when a boy dragged home a bundle of windfall bigger than the law's generosity. Charcoal sat between wood and flame, a craft of almost fire that made forests last longer. In a clearing, colliers raised a dome of billets, covered it with turf, and watched the smoke speak. Blue meant too cool, white too hot, a curl too fast meant vents to pinch. Nights were passed in the half-sleep, faces smudged, ears tuned to the whisper of a burn that, if managed well, turned logs into dense black promise for forge and hearth both. When a clamp failed and flared, there was swearing, then laughter, then a rebuilding. Failure was part of instruction. Eyebrows grew back. Not all fuel smelled like forest. Dung, patient, ever-present, became winter's accountant. Summer yards were a choreography. Sweep mixed with chopped straw, trowel into little cakes, thumbprint in the center so they'd dry even, then line them along sunny walls in ranks like coins set to dry after washing. Come winter, they burned without drama, a long smoulder that kept a pot muttering. The smoke stung eyes and wrote its own signature on rafters, but its thrift was undeniable. Ash from dung went back to the garden, closing a loop that even the wealthiest kitchens begrudgingly admired. Braziers had their own etiquette, portable baskets of coal or charcoal that warmed hands and toes, safer than sparks in a drafty hall, dangerous in a closed room greedy for air. Open hearths made spectacle and soup, but they also sent warmth to visit the ceiling beams. So people learned shortcuts. A trestle table pulled near, a settle's high back making a pocket of heat, a canopy bed turned into a tiny climate where breath and curtain made a small dune. Towns learned caution by ash and loss, a timbered street A winter wind and a cinder could teach a city new humility overnight. Bucket lines became muscle memory. Cisterns were kept full. Neighbors knew each other's doors and shouted names in the right order. Here's a midnight scene. A glint in thatch becomes a bead, then a lick. Someone smells the wrong heat and pounds the lane with bare feet, banging shutters with a pole. Doors open. A chain of hands forms without conversation. Well buckets slap the lip. Water arcs silver in moonlight. Shoulders heave. A ladder scrapes stone. A boy climbs higher than his mother would permit in daylight, and a wet blanket slaps onto the glowing patch. Steam hisses like an angry cat, and the street exhales in one long sound. In the morning, the scorched square will be trimmed and patched, a new caution stitched into habit. Meanwhile, law and custom kept shaping flame. In some woods, you could only gather on designated days, your bundle measured by a thumb width on a stick. In others, you owed a faggot tax, so many tied bundles each year to the manor kiln. Brew houses scheduled their fires so smoke wouldn't argue with neighbors. Bakers shared ovens to save wood. Heat spent once turning 100 loaves brown. Even ash was counted. A potash seller came by, paying a little for the pale powder that would leach into lye and make soap or sweet and sour soil. When warmth is scarce, bodies become fuel in the kindest sense. People sit closer, share cloaks, swap night watches so everyone sleeps sometime near the hearth. Wit keeps cold at arm's length, equipped that peat is just last year's grass with ideas above its station. A promise that dung fires make the soup honest. The house learns to use every inch. A brick warmed at the edge of the embers and tucked into a footsack. Stones heated and slid under rushes before bed. Shutters pinned with a wedge that leaves just enough draw for smoke. Winters taught patience. You banked the hearth as if it were a small treasury, hid coals like coins, and spent them with care at dawn. Forest, bog, yard, and byre loaned their heat in different currencies. The art was living within your means, without letting the cold collect interest. And every night closed the same way. A last look at the roof line against the stars. A palm briefly hovered over the banked red under ash. A small nod to the warmth that would wait for morning. When cold sits like a thoughtful guest who refuses to leave, you answer by shrinking the world until it's warm again. The big room becomes many small rooms without moving a wall. A bed isn't just a bed, it's a chamber. 4 posts lift a little tent from the floor. Boards or curtains enclose the sides, and a thick canopy holds in breath and body heat. Drawn at dusk, those hangings turn 2 sleepers into a small stove. A child slides in at first light to borrow that pocket of June and dozes for 10 more stolen minutes. Tapestries don't only tell stories of stags and saints. They speak softly to the wind. A woolen hanging across raw stone breaks the chill that creeps from masonry, turning a wall from adversary to neighbor. Beneath your feet, layers build like seasons, rushes, mats, skins, stacked to slow the ground's slow theft of warmth. A stitched felt runner marks the path between hearth and bed, and the house learns your footsteps, answering with a little less bite at the heel. Lofts make a second sky where heat collects. Ladder rungs polish under hands and bare feet as families climb to sleep in air tempered by the day's fire. Up there the night breathes easier, smoke has thinned, warmth has gathered, and wood seems to last longer. Shared beds aren't just thrift, they're sense. 3 across fight drafts better than 1, and the steady rhythm of another chest becomes a lullaby that keeps the mind from listening too hard to the wind. Every piece of furniture is an insulation device with manners. A high-backed settle sits sideways to the hearth, carving out a warm alcove where cheeks pink and fingers thaw. A screen of boards, hinged to fold away by day, opens at night like wings to shelter a cradle from air that prowls along the floor. Even the chest at the bed's foot earns its keep. Blankets within, blankets above, and a sturdy barrier against the draft that tests the room at knee height. Windows are puzzles with seasonal answers. In summer, shutters swing wide to let the world in. In winter, you bargain. Shutters close, a horn pane turns grey with breath, and a candle persuades the little space to glow. You lift the latch to vent smoke and then set it back, thumbs width, to keep the draw. A strip of wool, rolled and tucked, quiets the sill's thin gap. You can chart the hour by how often a hand checks those seams. Light is precious, but not free. A horn window turns midday into a soft milk, generous enough to thread a needle, not enough to tempt you to linger. When work demands clarity, you move closer to the fire, tilt the rushlight, and accept the small trade of air for sight. Night makes its own acoustics. Curtains dull sound, and the room learns to whisper. A cough in the far corner loses its edge, and speech becomes wool-lined. Materials remember kindness. Bed curtains, heavy with use, take the air on clear, cold noons, flung over a hedge to let frostbite what you can't wash today. Mattresses, stuffed with straw or chaff, are turned and beaten, then filled anew before the worst months, so they lift the sleeper from the earth's cool pull. A warming pan skims under covers, trading coals for comfort, then hangs, to cool safely where small hands won't argue with its temper. In town, horn gives way to glass piece by careful piece, small panes caught in lead like frost crystallized and made permanent. Even then, shutters stay, because glass is light, not warmth, and the old rules still apply. Close, wedge, hang, layer. In grander rooms, arras lines the walls with woven gardens, but the logic is the same as a cottage rug tacked against a draft. Wool keeps company with breath and makes a microclimate wherever it hangs. Bathing in winter lives inside this architecture of nearness. The washtub comes to the hearth. Screens rise like hedges to make a warm corner. Steam makes its own ceiling under the canopy. You rig from spare cloth. You wash fast, dry faster, and laugh about the draft in the bathhouse door because you've earned the joke. Clean isn't a season. It's a set of tactics that sit well inside the rooms you build within rooms. And always, there's the habit of closing the world down at night. You bank the fire until it's a thought under ash. Curtains are drawn, the loft ladder pulled in, shutters barred, draft snakes fluffed and set like sleepy dogs along the floor. Breath thickens the small spaces you've made, and sleep arrives in layers. Outside, frost works patiently along the ridge. Inside, you've carved winter into manageable chambers and invited warmth to stay. Tomorrow, when the latch lifts, the big room will open again. But for now, the house is a cluster of warm nests, and you, tucked into one of them, feel how craft and habit turn cold air into something you can live with. Clean lives closer than luxury here. It's a practice, not a proclamation. Winter narrows choices, so people shift from the splash of summer to the craft of staying clean without courting a chill. You bring the wash tub to the hearth, rig a curtain from a spare cloth to make a warm pocket, and set a kettle to sing. Steam makes a ceiling. The rushlight dims to a soft coin. You wash in parts sensibly, face, hands, armpits, feet, each unwrapped, warmed, dried, then wrapped again, never leaving the body bare long enough for the cold to make its argument. Linen does more of the heavy lifting than legend allows. Clean shifts meet the skin, catching sweat and oils so wool doesn't have to be scrubbed raw every fortnight. On a pale noon, when the wind is dry and the sky has that brittle blue, you boil a small load with lye made from potash leached out of saved ash. The smell is sharp, the work steady, and the result is comfort. A shirt that's sun-sweet and a pillowcase that greets you like a field in June. Between boils, dry washing rules, warm cloths, a sprinkle of herb-scented water, a brisk rub that leaves skin rosy and awake. Bathhouses in towns keep their fires banked through winter, though not every day and not for every purse. In some places they're as social as they are steamy. Women in the morning, men later, attendants ferrying buckets, wood stacked in tidy cords, a brazier humming like a cat. You step through the notorious doorway draft with a laugh, because the room beyond holds a small summer. A quick immerse, a scrub with soap if coin allows, or a handful of bran tied in cloth if it doesn't. Then time to dry completely in the glow, before walking home under a wool hood that closes heat back inside. Rural parishes sometimes make do with a shared tub on saints' days, a borrowed copper set near the church bakehouse, warmth and water married by community permission. Myths fall away in the steam. People didn't never bathe. They bathed when it made sense, selective, seasonal, and social. In cold months, the rhythm slows, but cleanliness keeps to a tidy pulse. Combs sit like tools of state on the mantle, and every evening sees their teeth through hair. Lice hate attention and lose to it. Bedding finds the winter sun. You fling quilts across hedges, let frost bite what heat can't, and beat mattresses with sticks while jokes float with the feathers. Herbs find work beyond flavor. Rosemary in a rinse for the scalp, sage and thyme in a basin for feet, mint in a cloth to freshen a face before prayers. There's wit in the bathhouse doorway. The draft you fear most lives there, someone says, tugging a cloak tighter as they step back into snow. In the cottage, screens turn corners into sanctuaries. A child sits in a tub, no bigger than a wash tub, cheeks pinking, while a parent warms towels on the crane. Elders get first turn, children next, last the hardy souls who can weather a lukewarm rinse and still grin. The floor is dry before the fire drops, because damp is the saboteur of health here. A long-handled ladle scoops and pours gently. You keep the splashing small and the laughter big. Soap exists, though not in every house. Tallow boiled with lye yields a plain, useful cake, sometimes softened with a little ash to make a gentle scrub. Where coin is thin, soap is saved for hair and collars. For the rest, bran bags and warm cloth do faithful duty. Hands, though, are washed often. At the door after chores, at the table with a basin passed and a towel exchanged, at night with a small bowl, because skin carries work as well as warmth. Clerks write complaints about bathhouses and morals from time to time. Villages mostly write schedules and settle on rules. Close the shutters, keep the fire safe, dry everything you opened. Monks keep a quiet calendar of baths in winter, fewer than summer, more than never, paired with clean shifts and shaved crowns that need wool caps after. A lay sister in the infirmary warms stones, wraps them in linen and tucks them at feet before washing a fevered brow with water steeped in chamomile. The patient sighs. The room softens. Then comes the ritual that stitches cleanliness to rest. Feet washed, dried, and rubbed with a scrape of goose fat on a cruel night. A whisper of lavender hung near the bed. Fingers combed through hair until it crackles a little with health. Curtains close. A cough quiets. Outside, frost writes lace across the shutter. Inside, clean feels like warmth, and warmth like a kind of grace. In the morning, the room will smell of smoke, wool, and a faint green note of herbs. Winter's version of fresh. Winter evenings turn into workshops, and warmth begins at the spindle. Carding pulls burrs and thistle from fleece, aligning the fibers into soft clouds that catch the lamplight. A spindle hums with the same steady patience as a sleeping cat. Twist feeds into twist until a thread is born thin as a promise, strong as habit. On the loom, warp threads hold their taut little line while the shuttle carries weft across like a quiet ferry, and cloth grows in inches that feel like miles toward spring. Outside, frost writes its looping script on shutters. Inside, wool answers with the handwriting of hands. Fulling changes cloth from polite to practical. At the mill, hammers lift and fall in a heartbeat made of water and wood, pounding woven wool until it thickens, shrinks, and tightens into a dense, wind-stubborn fabric. At home, hands can full a small piece in a pan of warm water and soap, rubbing and rolling until a mitten becomes a fortress for fingers. Felting turns loose fiber into solid kindness. Caps pressed into shape over a turn bowl, insoles built from layers to stand between feet and the earth's slow chill. Repair is winter's craft and economy's poetry. Knees learn to wear an extra layer before the season's first chore. Elbows earn patches that begin as careful squares and become family coats of arms. Darning is architecture in miniature. Needle making bridges over a gap, then weaving a small town of threads that holds like good story. You slide a darning egg into a sock's heel, then build rows and columns until the whole forgets it was ever hungry. You don't throw out, you transform. A cloak too worn to keep rain becomes a shorter cloak for a child. Its trimmings turn into mitts. Scraps line a cap. The smallest bits pad a shoe or polish a spoon. Children grow on winter's schedule, so garments learn to flex. Hemlines carry a secret allowance. Stitches set with generosity so skirts can lengthen when legs do. Laces replace seams to offer a little more room by February. Gussets bloom under arms to make space for a stronger swing of the axe. Cloaks are cut down and rebound, sleeves swapped across two tunics so the best of both makes one that lasts. The needle's path is a map of choices. Here a running stitch for speed, there a backstitch for strength, always the sense of saving heat by saving cloth. Wealth writes warmth with fur. Sheepskin turns crowds of feet into a common fire. A lining of lamb or rabbit eases a night watch on stone. For the fortunate, squirrel or marten edges a cuff where wind first tests manners, and a fur tippet sits like a tame animal across a neck, turning breath into a private climate. For most, a folded wool collar and a hood do the same work in plainer language. Sheepskin vests move between stable and bed, grease brushed in to keep snow beading like pearls that roll away. By rushlight, a mother's hand guides a child's smaller fingers through cloth, showing how to pull the needle, how to turn at the end, how to breathe out as the stitch seats. The thread whispers against wool. The child's brow knots, then smooths when the line lies flat. A quick story keeps rhythm. A saint who patched his robe with stars. A neighbor who mended a glove so well it lasted through 2 winters and a courtship. The lesson is steady. A patch is not a shame. It's a signature of care. Tomorrow that child will pull on mitts they helped to make and feel a pride warmer than fleece. Layering stays an art you practice daily. Linen closest to the skin keeps damp in check, makes clean possible in a season that dislikes water. Over it, wool set by task, a tighter weave for windwork, a softer one for sitting still with a spindle. A sleeveless surcoat traps the heat of a torso without tangling in hands. A hood completes the circuit so warm air makes a loop from breath to chest and back again. At night, yesterday's cloak becomes a blanket for small feet. A square of felt slides under a hip where straw thins. A cap anchors sleep so dreams don't leak. Leather helps at the edges. Grease rubbed into boots turns sleet into beads and keeps stitching from sulking. A thong tied around a wrist keeps mittens faithful. Wooden patterns raise shoes above slush. And beneath, a felted insole and a handful of straw make an alliance that turns cold ground into something negotiable. On cruel days, you warm a stone by the hearth, wrap it, and tuck it between layers. On kind ones, you hang garments where smoke will season them and remind moths to mind their business. Clothing is memory and community. You know who spun that warp by the slight twist that sits in the yarn, who wove the weft by the rhythm that lives in the selvage, who stitched the seam by the tidy backstitch you'd recognize in your sleep. A borrowed cloak carries someone else's day's work and a little of their heat, and you return it with thanks and a small story. When the wind leans on the door, you answer with layers that think like walls, mended with humility, built with many hands, and you step into the weather wrapped in proof that care becomes warmth. Winter teaches a different kind of time, a clock that ticks by chores instead of chimes, by breath on the shutter and the length of a candle. Daylight is a brief guest, so mornings begin with a small arithmetic of warmth. Stir the embers, swing the crane for porridge, lift the latch to feed the room a thumb of new air so the fire draws, and people do too. You count minutes by steam and shoes, how long it takes to warm a cap on the settle, to lace boots stiff with yesterday's frost, to stack the day's kindling so no one reaches into the woodpile with cold hands. Tasks cue themselves by light. Outside jobs first. Water to break at the trough with a mallet's dull report. A sheet of ice lifting like a plate and shattering. Animals look back with steam for breath. You rake feed, check hooves, count noses. Fodder leaves the loft in measured armfuls because hay is a calendar and February is still a rumour. In lanes edged with rhyme, you shoulder a faggot, exchange a nod with a neighbour on the same errand, and toss a friendly remark about the wind's poor manners. The mill turns sluggishly but turns. You bring a small sack because the river's mood is a workmate no one orders around. While that was happening in the yard, the house found its rhythm. A spindle hums in a corner, marrying patience to product. The loom answers with a soft clack, a heartbeat that makes the room feel honest. Basketry grows in laps, willow rods soaking in a tub by the hearth, then bending into shape as fingers talk to memory. Tools come out for quiet repairs, an axe haft sanded smooth, a hinge reset, a stool leg repegged so it won't complain when someone leans their winter weight. Nothing new begins unless it pays its rent in usefulness by March. Communal rhythms hold the parish together. On the oven's appointed day, doors open along the lane, boards stacked with shaped dough, and a dusting of pride parade toward shared heat. The oven mouth glows like a sunrise where it shouldn't be, and you read the baker by their peel's quick economy. At the mill, turn-taking makes a line of small conversations, whose cow calved, which hedge broke under last night's gust, whether the road to market is more ruts than road. Brew days stagger, so are neighbours, House steams on Wednesday, yours on Saturday, and someone always has a dipper of small ale to loan when a fever needs coaxing. Children take winter's curriculum seriously. They learn to card fleece without swallowing a cloud, to twist a cord that binds faggots tight, to watch the fire with the respect given to both king and cat. Elders teach with the gentlest tyranny how to lay rushes so they don't become a damp lie, how to wipe a sill so the draft snake sits snug, how to listen for a pot that's thinking about boiling over before it does. Work is instruction. Instruction is love disguised as repetition. Animal care writes the hours in rounds. Midday you check water again, because ice grows back like stubborn thoughts. You fork bedding into stalls, trading yesterday's wet straw for today's dry, and moving the manure pile to a place that won't flood the path when thaw comes. In the yard, a henhouse latch gets a strip of leather to stop its rattle. Your breath fogs as you count eggs by the day's faint blessing of warm. Evenings expand like bread under a cloth. Storytelling begins not with a grand opening, but with a casual sentence tossed toward the hearth. That year when snow fell on Midsummer's Eve, or the day the peddler came with tin whistles and gossip. Song answers, not a performance but a habit. Drone, verse, a chorus that lasts long enough for hands to finish a seam or a basket's rim. Memories lay heat where the fire can't reach, pulling people close without crowding lungs. There's wit tucked into the work. Someone declares the cat foreman and blames it for any dropped stitch. Another swears the mill wheel sulks if you insult it, so everyone compliments it shamelessly. A child giggles and spills a handful of pegs. The sound rises like sparks and fades like them too, leaving the room warmer by a degree nobody measures. These are the microfires you tend alongside the hearth. Tease of what waits. The dark can get darker. When stores thin and fevers walk, when storms sit and don't move on, winter's lesson turns from patience to endurance. We'll bank the flames of brightness here and step carefully into that shadow next. There are winters that ask for patience, and there are winters that ask for everything. When rain sits on fields until grain sprouts and rots in its own cradle. When haystacks shrink before the first frost sharpens, hunger moves from a worry to a resident. The quiet arithmetic of the cellar fails you. Barrels echo, sacks slouch, and the family's gaze starts counting in days instead of months. You stretch broth with yesterday's water, grind peas into flour to bully bread into cooperating, and still the loaf is thinner than the hands reaching toward it. Hunger changes sound. Voices grow hushed to save strength. Spoons knock softly to avoid waking hope. Sleep is shallow and full of kitchens. Joints ache without the consolation of having earned it. The body becomes a ledger written in tight script. A belt hole new to you. A sleeve that fits too easily. A step that takes more will than distance. You make lists in your head. Who needs the last carrot most? Which neighbor's child looks dim around the eyes? Whether there's enough salt to coax the meat you don't have. Meanwhile, winter listens and stays. A village has stories from these seasons that it doesn't tell often. The year the ox collapsed in harness, and the men argued about whether to eat what also ploughed. The spring seed eaten to blunt a march that wouldn't move along. The quiet funerals where frost made a clumsy partner with grief. The priest speaks of charity, and the parish chest opens, not wide but meaningfully. A neighbor leaves a log by a door. A widow finds a loaf on her sill, with no name written in the flour. These are the little bridges over a river that has no patience for swimmers. Disease steps in when appetite steps out. Bodies without reserves give way where they once held. A cough that might have been an inconvenience now finishes the conversation. Lice ride closer on shared blankets, fleas travel in straw, and the air in tight rooms grows heavy enough to carry more than stories. Fevers take to settling in, making the skin bright, the eyes glassy, and the days blur into spoonfuls of broth and whispered encouragement. Care continues. The same broths, the same herbs, but the margin of success narrows until it feels like walking a footbridge in wind. Then there are years when a sickness doesn't come as a winter guest, but as a migrating procession, swift as rumor and more confident. Plague needs no introduction here, only acknowledgement. It arrives when ships make harbor and fleas make choices. It winds through lanes, marks households with a speed that makes counting look like superstition, and teaches the bell newer, heavier work. People close shutters, not against weather but against news. The market thins. Doors are opened and shut with cloth over mouths. You learn the shape of absence by the way a familiar corner of the square looks too large. Even so, care keeps its rituals. A lay sister wipes her brow and sings under her breath. A brother carries a loaf and sets it on a step, knocks once, steps away. The bath basin becomes a sacrament of sorts. Warmth, a clean cloth, the dignity of attention. A candle is lit, not to cure, but to say, we saw you. In some houses, the fever breaks and leaves. In others, the bed grows neat and stays neat, and a name is said more than once in the same hour. A bell tolls too often one week. A child asks why. The answer is honest and quiet. The next week is quieter still. Afterward, the village breathes like someone who climbed too fast. A field lies untilled longer than pride would like. A loom rests. A bench at the alehouse has 2 mugs and only one hand to lift them. Grief has its own winter that arrives regardless of month. People deal with it the way they deal with cold, in layers. Work over sorrow, prayer under work, song between. Here's a small scene that stays. A man walks toward the church with a spade on his shoulder. He passes a house where a woman sits on the step, a shawl pulled around her like an argument with the air. He stops, shifts the spade to the other shoulder, and says the only thing that both can bear, I'll help. Later, he will carry a ladder to a different door because the thatch needs minding and hands are fewer. Winter takes, the village answers by adding, we won't dwell. The point isn't to stare into the dark until eyes adjust. It's to note that people learn to carry a small light and to share it. Even in famine years, someone saved a pinch of seed for spring. Even in plague seasons, someone set broth where a hand could find it. The narrow bridge wasn't always crossed, but it was built daily. Breathe, step back with me, and feel how, after the shadow, the room reclaims its size. We'll move toward the quiet mercies that held people up. Bonds, arms, small feasts, and the kind of warmth that doesn't burn wood. After the hard road, the path widens. Winter still owns the fields, but inside the parish boundary, warmth is organized like a craft. Arms are not an idea. They're a list. The church wardens open the chest and count coins with cold fingers, each clink already promised. A sack of grain becomes 10 loaves spread across 10 doorsteps. A strip of wool becomes a cap for a widow's head. The priest speaks of mercy, but the congregation translates it into errands. Monasteries make charity a timetable. At the gate, the porter keeps a tally not to refuse but to pace the pot. Bread and a ladle of pottage move hand to hand with the steady rhythm of a psalm. On harsh evenings, the infirmera sends out a jug of small ale, because calories are care and warm hands can carry more hope. Names are learned, not for judgment but for distribution. Who needs broth without onions? Who must have the softer crust? Who can lift a bundle? And who must not try? Winter feasts do a different kind of work. After the solemnity of Christmastide, St. Stephen's Day brings organized mischief. Laughter licensed to air out the room. Wassail steams in bowls. A lord of misrule declares that the miller must sing and the reeve must clap on the offbeat. Beneath it sits a serious intention, to remind the village that hierarchy doesn't heat hands. For a day, roles are loosened, so bonds tighten. You go home with warm cheeks and the sense that your neighbor's door is yours in an emergency. There's a gentler calendar too. Plough Sunday's blessing lands not just on wood and iron but on shoulders, and the procession that follows puts soot on faces and songs in lanes. It tells the tired heart that winter is not forever, and that work returns with its own answers. Between saints' days, smaller rituals keep courage bright. A bowl of hot stones passed around the room, a story traded for a spool of thread, a chorus hummed while mittens drip on the settle. Mutual aid isn't a slogan, it's a route learned in boots. A group goes for wood with 2 carts, so one can come back full while the other loads. Roofs are checked in a friendly conspiracy. The thatch that lifted last gale gets tucked and weighted by 4 pairs of hands, and a shared joke about the wind's stubbornness. On market mornings, someone takes 2 lists because a child at the next hearth has a cough, and cold lanes aren't a prescription. Here's a small kindness you can almost feel. Before dawn, a neighbor leaves a single log by a door. No knock, no words. The household wakes to find it leaning like a vote of confidence. That log lasts exactly long enough to keep the porridge honest and the hearth from sulking. And the gratitude it lights lasts longer than either. Later, the same door quietly pushes out a half loaf in return. Exchanges like this knit more tightly than twine. In the leanest weeks, people make warmth from presents. An elder sits by the hearth and tells the story of the year the river froze solid enough to carry 2 carts, and the room discovers it has heat left in laughter. A child recites a clumsy verse. Applause, out of proportion on purpose, rises like a blanket. A hand finds another in the dim and gives a squeeze. These gestures burn no wood, yet lift the temperature of a house. The open loops close softly. Beer, once explained as safety and calories, proves itself nightly as a quiet strength in a cup. Bathing slower in winter continues with prudence that keeps illness farther from the door. Barn partitions, once described for heat, hum with the contented breath of animals whose warmth is shared without waste. The village weathers the season, not by heroics but by this practical fellowship, a series of small, repeated answers to cold. Breathe with me. The wind still prowls the eaves, but inside bonds hold like well-set stitches. Charity is a steady flame, kindness, a hand that knows the latch, and just beyond the hedge, a lighter sky begins to say what everyone hopes to hear. It begins so quietly you could miss it. The morning candle lasts a few minutes longer on the table before it gutters. The shadow of the pewter mug reaches for the same knot in the wood and doesn't quite touch it anymore. You feel it first as a pause in the wind's scold, a breath between gusts that wasn't there last week, enough space for a thought to lift its head. Day length announces itself in habit. The cow stands earlier at the byre door, ears pricked to a thinner darkness. The rooster's call lands closer to true dawn, as if his throat has been keeping time better than the bell. You notice, tying a bootlace, that you didn't need the second rushlight to find the hole. Indoors, the hearth's ember shifts from primary sun to faithful companion, the room discovering a little of its own glow even before you stir the ash. Outside, the lane sounds different. Snow, which used to squeak in absolute cold, now gives a softer, dampened crunch under patterns. Icicles thin at their throats and begin to tick, a slow metronome of melt along the eaves. Drips gather into a rhythm you can trust your steps to, and the bucket at the corner starts its pick-pick song as the roof remembers water. In hedges, the sparrows try out a phrase they abandoned in December, short and optimistic, cut off mid-bar as if embarrassed by their own hope. On a clear noon, the horn window goes from milk to a paler, almost watery gold, and you put the needle back in the cloth without squinting. The house smells different on these days, a faint damp of thaw edging out the tight, baked scent of wool and smoke. You unpin the bed curtains for an hour. Let air move like a polite guest through the room, and the straw mattress seems to breathe back with relief. The draft snakes droop. The shutter's bar feels less like a command and more like a reminder. Then comes the small heralds in the field margins. Snowdrops hedge the ditch like a row of whispered confidences, white bells that pretend not to ring. A crocus risks a cup of yellow where the wall catches sun, and a child crouches beside it, as if warming hands over a candle. Out beyond the yard, the soil changes color in streaks, darkening where the frost's grip loosens its fingers. The spade, set aside for months, gets lifted and weighed, and you can feel in your arms that Earth is a partner again, not a verdict. Plough Monday steps into this softened light with old shoes and evergreen bravado. The ploughshare, blacked and blessed, is carried shoulder high down the lane, garlands bobbing, soot smudged on faces in laughing penance for winter's sulk. The parson's prayer lands on iron, wood, and hands alike. The bell gives a single note that hangs longer, in thinner air, and in that tone, the village hears yes. The first furrow is cut where the ground yields, steam lifting in a shy plume from opened earth, and a cheer runs along the hedge like fire through dry rushes. You smell soil, honest and startling, and for a moment the whole parish seems to stand taller. Relief doesn't rush. It unfurls. Rations that were measured like coins begin to stretch without guilt. The last salted joints look less like a siege and more like a plan that worked. The cellar breathes easier. Crocks are shifted, not hoarded. On the ledger of hunger, the line steadies. A mother slides a thicker slice of bread without apology. An elder asks for a second ladle of broth and gets it with a grin. The children's coughs lift day by day, like fog burning away over a river. Songbirds return first as rumor, then as fact. A blackbird stitches the morning with a neat, bright string, and even the mill wheel sounds less aggrieved. You carry tools outside and don't bring them all back in haste. A cloak opens a button early. Washing is pegged with a confidence that the sky will keep its promise for an hour. The parish looks up more often. Faces turn to a sun that sits a finger higher. And still, there's prudence. Frosts come in late, petty raids. You tuck seedlings under straw at dusk and lift the cover at noon. The door's latch still knows cold's weight in the dark, but the long argument has turned, and the season that asked everything begins to give things back. Light goes last through the horn pane, and you stand a moment just to watch it. The day lets go gently, like a hand that has decided to stay. Recovery begins in small, sensible motions, the kind you can do with sleeves rolled and a list tucked behind your teeth. Seed is counted like treasure, not only by handfuls, but by memory. Which row gave well in a dry patch? Which corner sulked in shade? Which beans kept their promise in a wet year? You save the best from the best, drying pods in a quiet loft, where air moves and mice are discouraged by a tin rattle and a cat's patrol. A child learns the feel of a good kernel between fingers, the smooth weight, the sound it makes when it lands in a wooden bowl, and takes pride in setting aside tomorrow's bread while the scent of today's still hangs in the room. Tools gather near the door like company waiting to be asked in. A ploughshare is lifted, worked bright along its edge with a careful stone, and a smear of fat is rubbed in to quiet rust. Handles are checked with an honest squeeze. If a haft complains, it's wedged or replaced before complaint turns to failure in the field. Thatch is read like a map, where the wind worried it thin, where a jackdaw filched a tuft, and ladders go up with practiced steadiness. New bundles thud into place, pegged and combed by hand, until the roof line looks like a sentence finished with conviction. Down in the cool, the salting cellar is made ready for the year's intentions. Barrels are rolled out into the yard, scrubbed and scalded, their staves swelling back into tightness as hot water steams in the morning light. Ropes are checked, hoops tapped. The smell is wood and clean. Hooks on the smokehouse beam get an oil rag greeting, and the chimney's drawer is tested with a twist of straw that curls into sweet proof. You chalk notes on a post, how much salt to lay in for autumn slaughter, which barrel took herring last Lent and will prefer pork this time. Agreements are renewed with the same dignity as a harvest blessing. At the manor, fuel rights are recited and affirmed. A stovers for this wood, cut on that day, carried in bundles you can lift without regretting it. The woodward nods, the reeve tallies, and the village hears the calendar click into place. Shared schedules go up like garlands. The oven's days set so loaves can swell without competition. Brew days staggered so small ale stays faithful and fresh. Mill time divided by sacks and patience. It's not bureaucracy. It's warmth arranged through courtesy. Smokehouses are scrubbed of last year's story. Soot softens under a damp cloth and gives way. The floor is raked, the door rehung to kiss its jam without sulking. Knots of herb are set aside for later, juniper for a sharper perfume, oak for steadier coals, and someone laughs softly at the memory of an overzealous fire that once wanted to turn meat to memory. Lessons become habit. Habit becomes insurance against hunger when weather tries a new mood. Children are folded into all this, their chores promoted to skills. A small hand learns how to lap barrel staves with a mallet's kind, persuasive tap. Another learns to twist a straw band that sits well on thatch and resists a greedy gust. Names attached to tasks. This is Jonas's neat hoop. This is Elin's careful line of tree nails. This is the way grandmother ties a string of onions so they dry without speaking to rot. Memory becomes instruction that outlives voices. In the corner of the cool house, jars and crocks line up like a patient choir. Wax seals are tested with a thumb. Linen covers are rinsed and sun-dried, then stacked flat. Vinegar Mother is fed with a proud glance as if it were a small pet with old wisdom. And brine is remade, a bowl of salt dissolving into clear intention. Sacks are mended before they're needed. The patch that saves a seam now saves grain later, and every stitch is a sentence against panic. The village lifts its gaze to a wider horizon and speaks across hedges. A neighbour with a strong barley year pledges a tithe to the poor box. Another with a good line on salt will trade for linen. You exchange a surplus of turnip seed for a clutch of apple grafts and learn to bind them to rootstock with a twist that feels like tying hope to history. The parish chest, filled and emptied all winter, acquires new coins with fewer sighs, and the loops close neatly. Beer, remembered as calories in a cup, is brewed with an eye to both thirst and strength when labour peaks. Baths return to a lighter, more frequent rhythm as air warms and basins need less courage. Barn partitions, once explained for heat, stand as proof that animals and people can share shelter without sharing sickness when space and straw are set with intent. You look down at your hands, chapped, mended, sure, and see next winter already taking shape in the choices you make today. Step with me across the map now, because winter's lessons wore different coats depending on where the wind came from. In the far north, where the sea knits land to livelihood, Norse coast leaned on salt and smoke as if they were saints. Fish hung in ranks from eaves, skins stiff, bellies empty, but promises full. Cod turned into stockfish that clacked like wood when you knocked it and soaked back into life in a pot. Turf roofs met weather with weather, earth against air. Thick sod cut in summer set above timber walls, moss and birch bark layered so that snow became a second insulating blanket. Smoke found its way through a loose weave in the rafters, and people found their way to warmth by clustering under roof beams low enough to catch breath. Ale was thick, strong when the day asked for courage, small when the throat simply asked not to crack. While that was happening beside the ice-edged Atlantic, the Mediterranean faced a different winter, less a siege, more a season of rain and short light. Stone houses stored the day like jars store oil, releasing it in a slow exhale at dusk. Olive wood burned clean and careful. Fires were modest but faithful. Cellars carried the green memory of autumn, amphorae of oil, casks of wine, salted anchovies, citrus tucked into cool corners like bottled sun. When rain kept fields honest, transhumant flocks moved along old paths, from mountain summer to coastal winter, shepherds stepping the same stones their grandfathers did, wool and milk following grass in a soft migration that wrote warmth with hooves. In the Low Countries, land met water in a year-round negotiation. Winter pressed water inland. People pressed back with dikes and willows, woven into living fences that drank floods and shrugged them off. Peat was banked in tidy stacks. Brown bricks cut from bogs in summer and hoisted onto barges that slid along canals, even when roads sulked into mud. In towns, gables leaned toward each other like conspirators, making alleys that held heat and kept wind arguing above head height. Communal ovens turned long dough into long loaves. Breweries laced streets with the scent of malt and promise. When ice traced the canals, skates made travel quick and almost cheerful, iron biting into a new sort of road. Climb now, and the Alps say winter with a full voice. Here, roofs reach almost to the ground on the windward side, eaves deep enough to shelter a man and a cow, beams set to bear months of weight. Houses sit atop barns so animal heat rises through floorboards into family rooms. The cow's slow breath and the sheep's quiet chewing are part of the night's grammar. Hay is summer's gold, stacked under wide hats of thatch or shingles. Rakes and sledges live ready for the sudden fall that asks for a quick, neighbourly path cut to a half-buried door. Cheese is storage in a wheel, Milk turned into a patient circle that improves as snow deepens, a meal that wills itself forward into March. Across the Central Plains, Germany, Bohemia, Poland stitched winter together with woodlots and rites written into memory. Coppice cycles kept fuel faithful. Charcoaling made forest into slow fire for metal and supper both. Villages placed themselves on knuckles of higher ground above wet meadows that fed cattle and geese. Smokehouses stood like stout punctuation marks at the edge of yards. In markets that never fully slept, even in frost, a braid of onions was a promise, a sack of rye an argument against despair, a flask of beer the steady friend of both labour and story. To the east, on colder, wider horizons, Russia's winters taught different thrift. Izbas built of thick logs chinked with moss, and clay held heat like a hand. The masonry stove was a throne, a bed, a baker, a judge of patience. Bread was black and dense, a slab that asked for strong teeth and gave strong mornings. Kvass kept thirst modest and health modestly protected. In villages half buried by drifts, paths ran like tunnels. Bells sounded shorter and sharper in air that made sound itself seem brittle. Sledges did the work of wheels without complaint. Fur and felt wrote the difference between outside and in. Cities felt winter as a test of systems. Paris layered tapestries on stone and lined halls with screens that turned drafts into detours. Venice watched water levels as closely as saints' days and built its winter on woodpiles ferried from upriver and stacked like fortresses behind palace walls. Barcelona sailed trade through gentler seasons and used them to cushion the short, hard months. London learned to keep its lanes cleared and its hearths disciplined, to share heat in bathhouses whose doors leaked jokes and steam in equal measure. Yet everywhere, constance held. Fuel rationed by custom and enforced by neighbors' eyes. Food put by with salt, smoke, and common sense. Houses thickened into nests within nests. Wool layered over linen to make portable rooms. Bodies gathered when breath turned to frost, and laughter was cheaper than firewood. Disease traveled old roads and made new ones, taking advantage wherever air grew stale and bellies grew quiet. Care followed stubbornly with broth, herbs, and the insistence that names be said. Letters crossed mountain passes and frozen flats with blotched ink and stiff fingers, carrying news that boiled down to the same refrain. We are cold, we are managing, we are waiting for light. And across north, south, lowlands, and high, winter taught the same craft with regional accents, how to turn ordinary materials into a season-long answer, how to trade skill for heat, and how to keep one another alive until the ground spoke green again. There's a moment, deep into the night, when the wind that's been narrating the eves all evening simply loses interest and steps away. The house, surprised by silence, exhales. In the quiet that follows, small sounds rise with new importance, a chorus of soft reports arranged by habit and warmth. The rafters shift a fraction and answer themselves with a wooden sigh. Floorboards settle, not complaining, just noting that the day is done. From beyond the partition, livestock breathe in companionable rhythm. Slow draft horse lungs, a cow's low hush, a sheep's occasional drowsy stamp that brushes straw for a more precise comfort. Closer in, the hearth ticks like cooling pottery. Coals blink under ash and make their dry private music. A crisp crack, a faint ring, a listening hush, as if heat were thinking. The iron hook remembers weight. It swings imperceptibly and touches the back stone with a kiss no one sees but everyone hears. The kettle lid quivers once, sighs off a teaspoon of steam, then settles into patience until morning. On a peg, a wooden ladle nudges its neighbor, and the sound is a hollow, kindly cluck. The kitchen's heartbeat slowed to sleep. You hear cloth too. Bed curtains stir with the smallest convection. Wool answering breath in a whisper that belongs to winter alone. A blanket's edge is lifted and set again. The sound is the softest river, as a foot seeks warmer ground and finds it. In the loft, straw shifts within a mattress, releasing a faint grassy ghost of summer that threads the air with a memory you can almost taste. Someone turns, and the rope bed offers its low, agreeable creak, a reassurance that the knots you tightened last week were worth the bother. Further still, the house keeps company with itself. In the corner, a rushlight guttered earlier and left a thin thread of scent, tallow, smoke, a whisper of time from the leaf you lit with it. The horn window, frosted into delicate ferns, tightens as the outside cold asks another question. The shutter bar answers with the smallest wooden murmur. A draft snake along the floor inhales and exhales very slightly as the room's air finds its rhythm. Stuffed cloth breathing the way a sleeping dog sometimes does when it dreams. Human sound is careful here. A child laughs once in a dream, barely a bubble, and a palm finds a shoulder, not to hush but to share the joke silently. A cough in the far palate is caught in a sleeve, softened by wool and courtesy, and the room closes over the ripple, as water does over a pebble. A prayer arrives barely spoken, not a plea, not tonight, just a plain thanks for the banked fire and the bodies counted warm. The words stand a moment in the dim and then fold themselves into sleep. There are winter rumors even in stillness. In the flue, with no wind to scold it, an owl's question travels the chimney like a message from a neighboring century. The rafters answer with nothing more than continued presence. A mouse considers the grain bin, decides against any enterprise that would be noisy, and contents itself with the tidy rustle of changing its mind. Somewhere under the eaves, a rafter crack makes a sound like ice briefly remembering water, then thinking better of it. If you listen closely, there's a sound not made by wood or wool, the almost audible feeling of a house that has done its work for the day. Heat has found its pockets and refuses to wander. The partition's boards hold the gentle stall breath on the animal side and the human breaths on this side, letting them trade warmth without trading weather. A warming stone wrapped in cloth under the bed gives out its slow, reliable currency, and the cloth remembers the hand that tucked it there. Micro-stories move across the hush. A mother's thumb traces the seam of a small mitten lying by the settle, pleased with the evenness of the stitches she taught earlier. A father thinks of the first furrow that will cut in a few weeks and hears, in tonight's quiet, the far-off hiss of steam from opened earth. An elder at the edge of sleep counts, tools mended, buckets filled, embers banked, and lets the numbers add up to enough. Even the cat, promoted to foreman in jest at dusk, keeps its watch with eyes barely open, tail ticking once like a metronome that trusts the time. Then the deepest silence arrives, the one that makes even thought tread softly. It isn't empty. It's full of kept promises. The coals promise morning. The roof promises to stand. The rope bed promises to hold. The neighbors' doors, only a shout away. Promise, neighbors. You lie within all those assurances, a small warmth in a carefully arranged nest, and the last sound you notice before sleep is the house agreeing with itself. A faint, contented settling that says, The wind has gone. The night is ours. Rest now. The house is quiet. The night held like a folded blanket, and in that gentleness the lessons of winter arrange themselves where you can see them. Resilience isn't a thunderclap. It's a craft. It looks like wood stacked by height and dryness, kindling in bundles that a child can carry, a fire laid to take quickly when hands are stiff. It sounds like lists read in the head at dusk, doors latched, embers banked, pails filled, tools where the dark can't hide them. Prepared, shared, repeatable, the pattern that turns a brutal season into a solvable problem assembled from many small pieces. Fragility isn't a failure, just a truth acknowledged. Grain can rot in a wet August, a cough can find a body thinned by February, a roof can lift if a gale insists. The answer the village gave wasn't bravado, but choice, interdependence, elected daily. Warmth moved along lanes in the shape of loaves and logs. News moved with it. Who needed quiet? Who needed broth? Who could trade an hour at the oven for an hour at the hedge? The lone hearth burns out. The parish keeps a steady flame by lighting one another. What sustained this was the technology of the ordinary. Wool did more work than iron ever could in January. Lanolin's slick fibers spun tight, woven dense, full to shrug at wind, layered over linen that kept skin honest and laundering practical. Wood, split on a dry day and dried on a good wall, became months of heat parceled into evenings. Salt made time elastic, turning harvest into winter meals that kept muscle on bone and steadied minds. Yeast, quiet, domestic, almost conversational, lived in cellars and kneading bowls, raising bread, brewing ale, storing calories in forms a cold day could accept. These materials weren't glamorous, they were faithful. Climate had moods and people learned to read them without pretending to command them. Years of softer winters invited expansion. Years of hard frosts insisted on thrift. The rhythm wasn't a march, but a dance. Steps adjusted to the ground, pivots taken when the music shifted. You can see adaptation in coppice cycles that returned fuel without killing forests, in root clamps and pits that kept carrots crisp and earth-colored until birds tested songs again, in bed curtains turned into bath screens, when the wind allowed and folded away, when it didn't. Nothing was wasted, neither heat nor habit. Meaning also arrives in the loops we opened and now lay gently closed. Beer mattered because it carried grain safely through water and time, a drink that fed as it quenched, and did it with less risk than a ditch or a well could promise in January. Bathing didn't vanish, it learned winter's manners, shorter, nearer to the hearth. Social when there was a bathhouse, tactical when there wasn't. Livestock just beyond a partition were not merely wealth, but warmth, their slow breath lifting the temperature, and the spirit of the room where people stitched and told stories. All of it together made a grammar of survival you could teach a child without frightening them. There's a quieter lesson beneath. Attention is heat. The bed turned, the seam reinforced, the sills gap stuffed and checked by thumb width, the broth salted just enough for appetite to return. These are kindnesses that travel. They're also a way of thinking that works outside winter. To notice is to care. To care is to change what cold can do. And what of now? You in your room, the night different, but still long. Gratitude doesn't need speeches. It needs a hand on a warm mug, a thought spared for the chain of people who figured out how to keep a house breathing through frost. A small resolve to be someone's extra log on a lean morning. If you're listening for instruction, winter's voice stays even. Prepare early, share often. Mend what you can. Rest when the work is set for dawn. The wind may return by and by, but for the moment the silence is a gift. You've walked through rooms within rooms, watched light lengthen, learned winter's vocabulary of wool and wood, salt and yeast, habit and help. Let the house agree with you. Let your breath make a private climate under the covers. The hard season taught its meaning quietly. Warmth is made together. Now sleep, and keep a little of that warmth for tomorrow. Now, lift your eyes from the horn-lit room to the one you're in. The walls hold steady heat. The window seals with a tidy click. And somewhere a quiet machine hums like a domesticated winter, working while you rest. No scolding wind sneaks under your door unless you let it. Light answers a finger. Water runs warm on command. And a kettle sings because you invited it to. This is comfort, not a crime. Just notice it, like you'd notice sunrise after a long night. There's no scolding here, only a soft contrast. The cold you meet is a brief handshake at the curb, a minute on a platform while the bus decides to arrive, a dash across a parking lot with your shoulders raised like shields. Then keys turn, heat arrives, and the world settles into friendly temperatures again. That small mercy is the end of centuries of experiments with wool and wood, salt and smoke, patience and sharing, written into pipes and wires so ordinary they vanish until they fail. Let the old rooms stay in view like constellations you can still see past your ceiling. Think of the bed curtains. Your duvet does the same quiet work without the cords and hooks. Think of the rushlight. You've got a lamp that never drips tallow and never gutters when the door opens. Think of the kettle on the crane. Its grandchild steams on a tidy base that doesn't demand wood or coaxing. Everyday magic is only the accumulation of yesterday's careful answers. If you want a small practice that keeps the thread unbroken, there are easy ones. Stack your own kindling in a way. Lay your morning out tonight so dawn is kinder. Bank your own fire. Close apps, dim lights. Set a timer that makes sleep easier to find. Mend what phrase, a seam, a plan, a habit. Put a blanket where the evening's cool gathers. Make a humble broth on a weeknight just because your future self deserves something warm. These are old gestures wearing modern clothes. And generosity, it travels well. In winter, the smallest things weigh more. A pair of gloves left on a public rail where cold hands pass. A transit card with a few rides tucked into a pocket you know a neighbor uses. A check-in text that reads like a delivered log. You good? A pot of soup portioned into jars. 2 kept, 2 shared. A gift card slid to the school nurse. A shelf-stable bag dropped at the food bank. A tip rounded up because someone else has been on their feet in the wind all day. None of this fixes everything. All of it fixes something. Some nights are still cold for some people. A drafty apartment that argues back. A bill that makes someone hold their breath. A walk to a job that ends after the last bus. Remember the barn partition. The way animals warmed people, and people cared for animals without waste. The modern version is a community room open late, a library radiating light, a church with cocoa and outlets, a shelter bed, a heated space announced without fuss. If that's not your lane tonight, keep it in mind when it becomes yours. Gratitude can be practical. Touch the radiator and say thank you to the chain of hands behind it. Fill a kettle, and in the minute it takes to warm, choose one small act that tilts somebody's evening toward ease. Fold a spare blanket by the door as if it were a promise. Put your boots where you won't trip in the dark. Check the latch like a quiet ritual. These are kindnesses that raise the room's temperature without turning a dial. Spring will come for you too. Later sunrise, shorter coats, open windows, laundry that smells like wind and sun. Until then, keep winter's good grammar close. Prepare early, share often, mend what you can, rest when the list is done. Your warm room is earned and shared across centuries. Their cold night is closer than it looks, and softened by the simplest bridges. Now let the heat in your mug match the heat in the story you've carried. Breathe. The house agrees with you. The wind may test the glass, but inside you've made weather of your own. Close your eyes. Let old patience keep you company. Snow hushes the fields, smoke rises in steady lines. Footprints soften, filling as the light thins. Hearths glow like a scattered constellation. One bell, one note. A door closes gently. You turn toward warmth. Wool at your neck, quiet in your chest. The night widening like breath. Winter's lessons settle softly. Prepare early. Share often. Mend what you can. If this calm journey kept you company, subscribe for more quiet histories and gentler nights. May your room hold its warmth, your rest come easily, and morning arrive like a friend. Good night.